Welcome, everybody, to the presentation by Emily Potter on invasive plants. I'm Dorgan Keeney. I'm a librarian here at Johnson Public Library, and I'm going to let Emily introduce herself, but I just wanted to mention that she welcomes questions throughout. So you can write them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll try to keep track, or just butt in if I'm missing your question. People should know that this is going to be recorded and archived on Green Mountain Access Television, which puts all their stuff on YouTube. So when they finally put it up and send me a link, I'll put it out on Front Porch Forum, or you can search on their website for it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Potter. I'm the Lamoille County Forester with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And then I went to UVM and studied forestry there. Now I live in East Calais, Vermont. I'm here this afternoon, native and how to identify them, options for treatment. So non-native invasive plants are a threat to Vermont's forests and other ecosystems and the wildlife that depend on them. You've probably encountered them in your woods or even in your own backyard. Non-native invasive plants are vigorous, fierce competitors that can outcompete native plants, reducing biodiversity and changing the composition of native ecosystems. So increasingly, unfortunately, this is something that I advise landowners on a lot. So I'd like to discuss different options for control and a way to think about how we do it in the most effective and efficient way possible. If you're here, I'm guessing that this might be something that you've struggled with. So hopefully I can give you some light at the end of the tunnel, or at least some ideas about how to proceed. But just briefly before we get started, I wanted to give you a little background about what county foresters do. So county foresters are one of the ways that the state of Vermont supports private landowners. Vermont is 75% forested. 80% of those lands are owned by private landowners, individuals, families. And so we have a huge interest in making sure that those privately owned forests.
Emily, your audio is freezing.
Outdoors recreating, just to name a few. So it's important that we take care of them. There are a few different parts to a county forester's work. I administer a program known as the Use Value Appraisal Program, or Current Use, which is a tax abatement program for lands greater than 25 acres. I'm also available to provide assistance to any forest landowner, regardless of acreage. So if you live in Lamoille County and have forested land, you can reach out to me with questions or concerns, and I'll try to do my best to provide you with the information and tools you need to manage your property well, for all of those benefits that I mentioned.
Emily, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're cutting out on your audio, and someone suggested you turn off your video to see if that helps.
Turn off my video. Okay. Let's see here.
Turn off your video. We may not see your slides. I don't know. Somebody knows more than I do about this, but.
No, it'll just save bandwidth because we won't be sending her image of her face.
Okay.
And
Right. Okay, so stop video. You can still see my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully that helps. I'm sorry about that. So I don't know where I cut out a bunch, but should I just proceed, I guess? Okay, so now that you've got a little background, I'm not sure how much you heard of that. I apologize. Living in Vermont here, I guess. We can get started talking about the problem of non-native invasive plants. So while there are over 2,800 native plant species in Vermont, there are about 600 non-native species that are here. Only a small proportion of these non-native species are considered invasive. We have 39 state-listed noxious weeds, most of which are the plants we've become familiar with because their infestations are already somewhat widespread in Vermont, like buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry, Japanese knotweed. So what are invasive exotics? They're non-native exotic organisms that are plants, animals, insects, or pathogens present in a location outside of their native range. Invasives spread prolifically in a way that's harmful to our native environment and biodiversity. So some characteristics of non-native invasive plants is that they're fast spreading and capable of vigorous growth. They're generalists, meaning that they can grow almost anywhere. They're prolific seed producers. Some are allelopathic, which means that they can transfer chemicals into the soil, thereby making soil conditions inhospitable to other plants. Sometimes those soil conditions will linger on for years, even after those plants have been removed. So it takes those areas a bit of time to recover once the plants have been removed. Invasive plants are extremely resilient. Many have the capability of layering and vegetative reproduction, sprouting, just plain surviving. And they're lacking predators or environmental constraints of their native habitats. So in essence, they're released from evolutionary. So what's so bad about non-native invasives? Well, they're able to outcompete our native plants and often form dense thickets where nothing else grows, including young trees. They create monocultures by outcompeting native species, thereby reducing biodiversity on the landscape. Many fruit that's low in nutritional value, and some have diuretic effects on wildlife, which helps many of them to spread. And some, like honeysuckle and barberry, are known to harbor higher tick populations because they create these microclimates in the dense infestations that they create.
Emily, could I ask you a couple questions? One is in the previous slide, you talked about layering. I wondered if you could explain that. And also, why would diuretic effects on wildlife help them to spread?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You talked about layering in the previous slide.
Yep.
And I wondered what that was, and also you talked about a diuretic effect, which helps them to spread. And I wondered if you could explain that. Did you hear me?
Rooting, when a branch touches the ground, that branch can root, and that's known as layering. And the diuretic effect, especially buckthorn is one that does this, but it causes wildlife to have diarrhea. So they'll eat the seeds and then they're instantly spreading the seeds around.
Thank you.
Okay. So I can proceed? Okay. So I'm not sure where I got cut off there, so we'll start. So why do we care? The main reason that we care is because non-native plants displace and outcompete our native plants, and in doing so disrupt a whole web of organisms. Organisms in our environment aren't isolated from other things. They're a part of a whole ecosystem, and there are relationships and connections that are important to the whole. If you think about a forest, it isn't just a bunch of trees, but it's a massive web of life, from the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil that helps plants to capture nutrients and soil moisture, to the cracks and crevices in tree bark where insects live and hide and where birds glean meals. Everything's interconnected, and many things in ways that we don't fully understand. The leaves of ash trees, for example, are calcium rich, and when they fall to the forest floor and decompose, they add calcium to the soil, making conditions more favorable for nearby plants and trees, especially sugar maple, which requires calcium-rich soils to thrive. That's just one example, and there are many others. There are also specific things we know about non-native invasive plants, such as the fact that they produce fruit that's less nutritious than those of our native plants. Some non-native plants produce a fruit that's diuretic to wildlife, as I mentioned. Common buckthorn's scientific name is Rhamnus cathartica, for example. Cathartica being a reference to catharsis. It gives birds and other wildlife diarrhea. Another specific example is that non-native invasive plants harbor a much lower density and diversity of invertebrates, namely caterpillars, than native plants. And so in places where non-native invasive plants dominate, there isn't as much food for adult birds to feed their young, for example, than there would be in an area dominated by native plants, shrubs, and trees. Most birds feed their young a diet made up almost exclusively of caterpillars because they're large, soft, full of protein, providing a lot more bang for your buck than feeding your baby bird aphids, for example. So if our landscape's dominated by non-native plants, which are barren of caterpillars, the baby birds won't have anything to eat. Interestingly, out of all the plant eaters in the world, caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other organisms than any other type of herbivore. So having native plants on the landscape to promote habitat for caterpillars is important. Many other ways that non-native invasive plants upset the balance of our native ecosystems, but the scariest and maybe most important of those is that heavy infestations of non-native invasive plants actually prevent our forests from continuing to be forests. So forests and other native systems massively benefit us. Forests produce public benefits like providing clean air and water, providing habitat for all our native organisms, sequestering and storing carbon, regulating our climate, mitigating and attenuating floodwaters, regulating our weather, making our world beautiful by creating the character and culture of our communities. Chances are that if you love living in Vermont, that forests are at least part of the reason why. So it's important that we protect them and help them to remain healthy and resilient. So biodiversity is really important. The countless beneficial relationships between different species enable the forest ecosystem to function and be self-sustaining. Some examples of the benefits of biodiversity include increased rates of pollination, nutrient cycling, seed dispersal, pest control, seed bed preparation. For ecosystems, resilience and adaptability, especially as we move into an uncertain future. We need forests to remain healthy amidst this huge amount of stress and to adapt and be nimble in the face of changing conditions. For wildlife, diversity provides a bunch of different habitat types for a huge range of different organisms. And for humans, biodiversity provides ecosystem services, the things that make our world work. Native organisms have the right to exist. They're important, and they're what make our forests and other ecosystems work. And we've learned that non-native invasive organisms threaten their existence. Along with habitat loss and climate change, biological invasions are considered a major threat to global diversity. Biological invasions of invasive organisms account for about half of all extinctions of native species for which the cause is known. And according to the Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by their interaction with non-native invasive species. Okay, so now that I've provided you with the depressing context, let's take a deep breath. Remember that we can do something about this problem. The first step is to learn to identify these plants when we come across them. So we'll get into identification of some of our most common woody invasive plants, as well as a few of the most common and widespread non-woody invasives. Part of learning to identify trees and any plants really is narrowing down the possibilities, which is why I'm going to go through a short list of the most common plants that you're likely to encounter. There are other non-native invasives to be aware of, but we probably don't have time to go through an exhaustive list today. So the plants that I'll mention are ones that I know are in Lamoille County presently, or that are on the fringes and are likely to show up within the next few years. So before we get started on the ID, I wanted to mention some good identification tools that you can download to your smartphone. iNaturalist and Seek are both free apps that you can use to identify plants, insects, trees, animals, mushrooms, lichens, just about anything. Use the camera on your phone to take a picture of the organism that you're trying to identify, and the app will tell you what it is. And if it can't make a positive identification, it'll connect you with this huge network of scientists who will identify it for you in a short time. My colleague Matt jokes about the fact that now that landowners that he works with have this app, he can't fake it anymore. Another thing to note is that early spring is a great time to be on the lookout for invasive exotics because they often leaf out before any of our native plants. The same goes for fall. Invasive plants seem to hold on to their leaves a lot longer than our natives, and they'll still look, perfectly green when other things are turning brown, leaves are falling. So if you're seeing plants leafing pretty early, take a second look. It's likely it could be invasive. So here's some common invasive exotics in Vermont. Interestingly, all these plants were introduced intentionally, and many as ornamental.
Emily, you cut out. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Cut out after you said many are ornamental, and then it was silence.
Okay. I'm sorry. What a nightmare. Okay, so you'll still see burning bush, Japanese barberry, honeysuckle growing in people's yards and gardens, throwing seeds, even though they're a state listed noxious weed that you can no longer legally transport or sell. We'll move into some identification tips now. And I just want to mention that I wouldn't expect you to leave this talk being able to identify all these plants, but at least you'll have a starting point and know which plants you're most likely to encounter. And you can work on learning to identify them as you come across them. A great website, vtinvasesorg. It's a great resource for identification tips, provides a lot of pictures and descriptions, common lookalikes. That's a great website if you're interested in learning more. So shrub honeysuckles are deciduous shrubs with opposite egg-shaped leaves, fragrant flowers, and red or orange-red berries. They can grow to be 15 feet tall and form really dense stands. There are 4 species of non-native invasive shrub honeysuckles in Vermont. All of the non-native honeysuckles in Vermont have a hollow pith. So if you cut the stem in half, the center will be hollow. Native honeysuckles in Vermont have a solid white pith, and native honeysuckles also don't tend to be as robust. They're typically small understory plants. Non-native invasive honeysuckles produce fruit. However, it's poorer in fats and nutrients than the fruits of native plants. I wanted to include this photo. It's from a property that I worked on in Sharon, where honeysuckle plants took over in an opening in the forest understory. And so in leaf off season, honeysuckle stands out as a light brown to grayish colored shrub. You often see it along roadsides and field edges or open areas. And the bark on larger stems looks kind of shreddy. So I just thought it'd be helpful to include some photos of dense infestations. Common buckthorn is a deciduous tree that can grow to 25 feet in height. Its bark is dark gray. The inner bark is bright orange, which is easy to see when the bark is peeled off or if you cut the tree down. Common buckthorn's branches are alternately arranged on the stem. It's got dark green, shiny leaves that have veins that curve towards the tip of the leaf, which you can see in the photo. Common buckthorn changes soil chemistry, increasing the amount of nitrogen and thereby impacting native species that can grow in the area. And as I mentioned previously, birds and mammals feed on the berries during the winter, aiding in the dispersal of seeds. So you can see the darker green colored foliage in the mid-story of the forest in this picture. This area is a property in Randolph. It was dominated by common buckthorn. And it's a concerning invasive plant because it can survive in forest understories. And the landowner in this photo was looking for ways to control this infestation prior to carrying out a timber harvest on his property. Japanese barberry is a small deciduous shrub that can 2 to 8 feet in height. It's got thin grooved branches with thin straight thorns. It's very shade tolerant and can form dense stands which shade out and displace native species. It's also been found to alter the pH and biological activity of the soil. And the dense stands formed by Japanese barberry create a microclimate or nursery for deer ticks, which can transmit Lyme disease. You can see how it can take over in forest understories in this picture. Common barberry is a deciduous shrub that can grow to be 13 feet in height. So it's quite a bit taller than Japanese barberry. It has arching branches that can layer when they come into contact with the soil, producing new
Emily, you cut out again.
and increases browsing pressure on native plants because deer don't like to eat barberry. Here's a picture of one on a roadside. They can be pretty large, and I don't know of any other plants that have flowers that look like that, so they're kind of ubiquitous. So Asiatic bittersweet is a deciduous woody vine that climbs saplings and trees and can grow to over 60 feet in length. It's got alternate elliptical to circular leaves that are light green in color, 2 to 5 inches long. The flowers are small and inconspicuous, scattered along the entire stem. They're greenish white in color, and they bloom from May to early June. The fruits are small and round, green when young, and they ripen to yellow and then split to reveal showy scarlet berries that persist into winter, as you can see in that photo. Bittersweet's a fast-growing vine that encircles trees and girdles them, slowly killing the tree. And vines can completely cover other vegetation, creating a carpet over a large area. Birds and other wildlife eat the fruit, thus distributing the seeds. The seeds have a high germination rate of about 90%. So you can see how it would spread really easily. It's just a picture of it growing up trees. So multiflora rose is a multi-stemmed thorny perennial shrub that grows up to 15 feet tall. The stems are green to red arching canes, which are round in cross-section and have stiff curved thorns. The leaves are pinnately compound with 7 to 9 leaflets. The leaflets are oblong, 1 to 1.5 inches long with serrated edges. It's got fringed petioles, so where the base of the stem of the leaf meets the plant, there are these fringes that I call eyelashes, which distinguish it from most other rose species. The flowers are small, white to pinkish, with 5 petals occurring abundantly in clusters in the spring. And the fruits are small red rose hips that remain on the plant throughout winter. Birds and other wildlife eat the fruit and disperse the seeds. Here's an image of a larger plant. So burning bush is a deciduous shrub that can grow up to 20 feet in height, which invades forests throughout the eastern United States. It often has 2 to 4 corky ridges that form along the length of young stems, but they might not be there if the plants are growing in shady conditions. It's got opposite dark green leaves that are less than 2 inches long, smooth, and they're rounded and tapered at the tip. The leaves turn a bright crimson to purplish color in the fall, which is why it's called burn. You've probably seen this plant in a neighbor's backyard garden or planted in front of your bank or in parking lots. The flowers are inconspicuous, greenish yellow with 4 petals, and they develop from late April to June. They lay flat.
Emily, your audio cut out again. Can you hear me?
Grow 3 to 20 feet in height. It's got thorny branches. It's easily recognized by the silvery dotted underside of the leaves. The leaves are alternate on the branch, 2 to 3 inches long, 1 inch wide. The margins are entire, which just means smooth and undulate, so they're a little bit wavy. The leaves are bright green to gray above and silver scaly beneath with short petioles. The flowers are small, yellow, tubular flowers, which are abundant on the plant and occur in clusters of 5 to 10 near the stem in early summer. The fruits are round, red, juicy drupes, which are finely dotted with silvery to silvery brown scales. Each drupe contains 1 seed, and they are ripe from August to November. So here's an image of burning bush that has taken over in the forest understory in this photo. And here's a dense infestation of autumn olive along the roadside. So Japanese knotweed is an upright shrub-like herbaceous perennial that can grow to over 10 feet in height. As with all members of this family, the base of the stem above each joint is surrounded by a membranous sheath. The stems are smooth, stout, and swollen at the joints where the leaf meets the stem. And although leaf size may vary, they're normally about 6 inches long, 3 to 4 inches wide, broadly oval to somewhat triangular and pointed at the tip. It's got minute greenish white flowers that occur in attractive branch sprays in the summer, followed soon after by small winged fruits. The seeds are triangular and shiny. They're pretty small, about 1/10 of an inch long. And if you've been by any rivers in Vermont recently, you've likely seen dense infestations of Japanese knotweed, as you can see in this photo. So common reed, also known as Phragmites, is a tall perennial grass that can grow to heights of 15 feet or more. You'll see it in areas where there should be cattails, but Phragmites has taken over. It's got broad pointed leaves that arise from thick vertical stalks. Its leaves can be 6 to 23 inches long, about a 1/2 inch to 2.5 inches wide, flat and glabrous. The flower heads are dense and fluffy, gray or purplish in color, 6 to 16 inches long, and they flower from July to October. The seeds are brown and lightweight, 1/4 inch long. In fall, the plant turns brown, but the flowers, which I call tassels, are consistent throughout the winter. Here's just a closer up image of their stalks. You've probably seen these plants. I believe they're spread across the entire US. So garlic mustard is an herbaceous biennial forb. The first year plants are basal rosettes, which you're seeing in that picture, which bolt and flower in the second year. The plants can be easily recognized by a garlic odor that's present when any part of the plant is crushed, which is likely why it's here. People planted it in their gardens because you can eat it in salads. The foliage on first year rosettes are green heart-shaped 1 to 6 inch long leaves. The foliage becomes more triangular and strongly toothed as the plant matures. Second year plants produce a 1 to 4 foot tall flowering stalk. Each flower has 4 small white petals in early spring. The mature seeds are shiny black and produced in erect slender green pods, which turn pale brown when mature. And as far as I know, garlic mustard isn't very common in Lamoille County, but I believe there's a patch of it in the recreation field parking lot off of Moscow Road in Stout, unless someone has taken care of it since I was last there. It was a few years ago. Okay, so those are all the plants that I was going to go through on this call today. But as I mentioned previously, those are the ones that you're most likely to come across in northern Vermont. And so good to keep your eyes out for them. And as I mentioned before, vtinvasesorg is a great place to go for more information.
Emily, it's Mary. Can I ask a question about Phragmites?
Sure.
If I see a tall grass with that kind of seed head, is it automatically Phragmites? Is there any smaller version of a native reed grass that I would see here, or am I always seeing Phragmites?
I think it's pretty likely to be Phragmites, but I can look into that more and get back to you. Let me write that down because that's a good.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested because I in knotweed travels, I came across some in someone's ditch, and it was a place where there isn't any other Phragmites, and this person was pretty clear that they had planted that, and it was a common reed grass that was not Phragmites. And I started to look into trying to ID it, and it turns out I think distinguishing between these things is maybe quite difficult. I'm not sure. So I'd be interested when you get a chance to know if there's anything that is native or yeah. Thank you.
I think I lost you for a second. Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes, Emily, can hear you now.
Okay. Yes, I will look into it, Mary. And it is possible that there's other kind that could have been planted that might not escape or something, but I'll find out and get back to you. So I just wanted to show a photo of garlic mustard in the second year of growth. This is what they look like. Okay, so now that we've seen the common invasives that we're likely to come across, as well as examples of their ability to take over large areas, you can see why we need to have a clear plan of attack and a goal for the outcome of our efforts. In many cases, complete eradication isn't possible. And this is due to several factors, including movement of seeds by wildlife and humans, the fact that many exotic invasives are vigorous and hard to kill, and the unfortunate fact that many invasive plants have seeds that remain viable in seed beds in the soil for years. So when openings are created in the forest canopy, those seeds are often the first to respond, which is why we see invasive plants established in open or disturbed areas. So understanding that eradication is not likely ever going to be possible, and instead approaching the problem knowing that any control work is helpful and that it will require long-term commitment is the right philosophy to have. Learning to identify exotic invasives in your area and removing them when you come across them will help to reduce the level of infestation and allow for native plants to continue to occupy the growing space. So I just wanted to bring up this point that my colleague Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester, brought up in a presentation that he gave on invasives. I think it's a great point, something I feel strongly about as well. Responsibility. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks about how when we own land, we inherit this bundle of rights. We own all the rights to this piece of land, like a bundle of sticks that we're holding in our hand. We have the right to cut down trees, to create trails, to put up posted signs, create gravel pits, whatever it might be. What we never talk about is responsibility. What responsibility we have to our ecosystems. This idea that we might owe something to them or that we might be responsible to them, just like we're responsible to each other. Especially in the case of non-native invasives, this is a problem that humans caused. It makes me feel responsible to the native ecosystems, and no one's going to do anything about it unless we do. What do we owe to our ecosystems? Are we responsible for solving these problems that humans created? It's not going to be simple or easy or comfortable, something that we might owe. The life of this beautiful ash tree, for example, is now threatened as the non-native invasive emerald ash borer infestation spreads throughout Vermont in the United States. It probably arrived here in solid wood packing material carried in ships or planes that came from its native Asia, and it's now killed millions of ash trees in the US. Humans have created a globalized world, and now it would seem to make sense that we might have some responsibility to be held accountable for our actions. So being proactive is really important. You can think of invasive plants sort of like a room of water. We might not notice right away that it's happening until it's too late and the water is over our heads. Infestations of invasive plants that are in the early stages, they cover less acreage. They typically have smaller plants with less developed root systems. They take less time, energy, and money to control. The worse an infestation becomes, the less options we have to manage it. Heavy infestations of invasive plants often require herbicides because manual control is no longer feasible. So when you see a small honeysuckle plant on the edge of your field, you can pull it right out of the ground. If we wait for the room to fill up with water, you're looking at a 20-acre infestation of honeysuckle shrubs that are 10 feet tall, 3 inches in diameter, that you now need to use a chainsaw to cut down. And then treat the stump with herbicide. So as it is with other things in life, being proactive is the best approach. So back to that bundle of rights, I wanted to bring up stewardship, working to maintain and enhance the land where we live, whether that involves removing invasive plants, preventing erosion on forest trails, maintaining wildlife habitat, and so on. We can make a positive impact on the earth by caring about the place where we live and working to make it healthy and resilient. So doing invasive control work yourself, it's always the most affordable and effective option. Using the right tools with enough tenacity, almost any invasive plant problem can be solved by working at it a few hours at a time. If you went out for dinner each day to work on an invasive plant control over time, depending on the size of the infestation, you'll eventually achieve control. And when they pop up again, you'll know what to do. So know what invasive plants look like, monitor for them every time you're in your woods or your yard, deal with them when they pop up before they become a larger problem. So now I wanted to get into some of the methods of control. Mechanical control, hand pulling, cutting, burning, smothering. Mechanical control just means not chemical. So using methods that don't involve herbicides to control the invasive plants. Mechanical methods should always be our first choice, but mechanical methods are also not always a realistic choice. Sometimes infestations of invasive plants are so heavy and dense that it would be nearly impossible to achieve a meaningful level of control mechanically. And this is because mechanical methods will require repeated efforts over years. And so for an average landowner, this might not be an option. So hand pulling is where you pull out the
Emily, we've lost you again. Emily, can you hear me? Emily?
Yeah.
You went silent again. You started to talk about hand pulling and then nothing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. So hand pulling, you would pull out the entire plant in the root system and hang it in a nearby tree or shrub so that the roots desiccate and the plant dies. But if you can't get the entire plant and the entire root system, it's not going to be an effective method. So it's best for smaller plants. You can use a weed wrench for larger plants like this woman in the picture is doing. And do your hand pulling in the springtime or after rains when the soils are wet, because it can help make pulling those plants out of the ground easier. And it's a good idea to bring a roll of flagging tape to hang flagging in those areas where you've done the hand pulling, so that you can return to pull out any sprouts that sprout up or plants that you've missed. And plan on multiple visits to the area to remove anything that pops up. Cutting is another option. It's not effective on woody plants unless it's a really small infestation, just because they'll always resprout. But if you're going to cut, try cutting the plants pretty high, like 3 to 4 inches tall. 3 to 4 feet tall, and go back to those plants for 5 to 10 years to cut back new sprouts. You can even just use your hand to pull off leaves, break the branches. The idea is that you're going to reduce the carbohydrate stores in the root system, eventually killing the plant. With Japanese knotweed, that'll be really hard. You're going to need to cut it every month of the growing season for the amount of time the patch has been established. So it is physically possible to control plants using these methods, but the question we need to ask ourselves is whether we have the time and the tenacity to continually work on the problem for multiple growing seasons, to cut each plant again and again and again and again and again, which is probably what you'll need to do in order to kill them. Smothering is another method used on Japanese knotweed, Phragmites, goutweed, garlic mustard. Essentially, you just use thick black plastic or hardware cloth, as you can see on that knotweed. You would lay the black plastic, after cutting the plants down, lay the black plastic over the top, make sure there aren't any holes, put something on top of it to hold it down, and then just wait 5 to 10 years, and maybe the patch underneath will be dead. The hardware cloth is kind of a newer method that I've heard about, where the plants are cut, they sprout up through this grid of hardware cloth, and as they grow, the hardware cloth will girdle them. It's the same idea that over time, the carbohydrate stores of the root system will be depleted, and hopefully, eventually, the plant will die. And as I mentioned, these methods are realistic over large areas because they can get really expensive. So this method of cutting Japanese knotweed and creating a drying stack was articulated by a local organization working to control Japanese knotweed in Hyde Park, called Knot in Hyde Park. I believe we have a couple of the leaders of that group on this call, so feel free to chime in if you have anything to add here. Success using this strategy depends upon 3 things. You have to keep the plant material from contacting the soil to make sure they're not going to root. Make a stack that's stable so that it isn't at risk of being carried away in rain. And don't put any root or rhizome material into the stack because those take a lot longer to die. And in the stack, they'll probably just be able to resprout. So here are here's some information that Knot in Hyde Park put out. So if you're out there and you'd like to chime in, provide any more information about the drying stack or anything, feel free to chime in. But I just wanted to include their nice materials that they've got for the people in Hyde Park. And I would say we might as well spread it throughout Lamoille County, get everyone on the lookout for knotweed. So burning invasive plants using a commercial torch with a propane grill tank can be effective against barberry. Sometimes honeysuckle, somewhat inefficient. The process is pretty time consuming and expensive. Using this method, you burn the base of the plant and any roots you can see until it turns cherry red and blackens.
You cut out again. I don't know if you can hear me, Emily.
First try.
Emily?
Yep, I cut out again.
You cut out again, but there's also a question in the chat from Ned Gardner. Is it effective to add nitrogen to a drying stack to speed decomposition?
I'm not sure. Mary, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I can just tell you what our experience has been. The drying stack idea is something that the Warren Conservation Commission started using 3 or 4 years ago. And we just started last spring doing them. And basically, if you're careful about what you put in the drying stack, just the stalk material, there really isn't any need to speed the decomposition, because what happened in all of our drying stacks is that the plants dry really quickly, especially around the edges and on the top. And by the end of the season, I mean, I'll go see them again in the spring shortly, but by the end of the season, everything was extremely well composted. And so it's not the green part of the plant material that is the problem if you're careful with it. It's the roots that come up in the rhizomes, and that's a whole different story.
Great, thank you.
This is Dorgan. Could you describe how these stacks work? But you pile the leaves on top of the soil, or you keep them up off the soil in some sort of structure?
Well, probably the easiest thing, it was very nice of you, Emily, to put our little note up on the screen. And the easiest thing is probably for you just to go to the Town of Hyde Park webpage that we have, and you can print off what we've done. But you can see a little picture, and what Emily's showing is that we put a piece of plastic down and then a wood pallet, but you could use some other, you could use a collection of sticks or whatever you have. And then there's some grade stakes on each corner to hold things in place, to give it a bit of a framework. And then you just alternately stack the cut knotweed material, and once you've done that patch, you leave it alone and come back and repull and keep adding it to the stack. And you'll see there's a picture of at the end of one of our drying stacks in October, and there's nothing left. But I don't know if our website isn't up just yet on the Town of Hyde Park thing, but it should be up this week, and you could get or Emily could send you a copy, or whatever works most easily. But thanks, Emily, for sharing that.
Okay, thank you for sharing it with me. It seems like a great method, so I appreciate you sharing that information. So I guess we'll continue on. When is mechanical treatment an appropriate option? You can use mechanical treatment on small and localized infestations, small plants that can be easily hand pulled out of the ground, certain woody species like honeysuckle that can sometimes be easy to pull up, or buckthorn when it's small enough. If you're a landowner with endless time, energy, and stamina, you have the finances to hire someone else to do it. So the pros and cons of mechanical control. The pros are obviously that there are no chemicals involved. The cons are that it's physically intense. It's going to require years of repeated visits to the same site. And it's really hard to achieve a meaningful level of control, except on small localized infestations. So being realistic is really important, because invasive plant control is a capacity issue. How much time and energy are you willing to spend working to control a small area? And then meanwhile, are there other areas where an infestation is creeping up because you've been focusing on this one area? You've got your blinders on. Are you setting yourself up to get frustrated and give up because of that? You're focusing on this one area and it's getting worse and worse elsewhere. So it's incredibly important that we work to control these plants to protect our native species, and being realistic about how and where we focus our efforts is going to help us achieve the most success, which is our real goal. So chemical control. Obviously, using herbicides is not ideal and should be our last choice, but there are times when the severity of the problem is so great that herbicides are an important tool in our toolbox. We can use them in a very minimal and very targeted way, not as the only answer, but as a part of the solution to these invasive plant problems. We use herbicides because we know that they work, and because we can apply them in a way that we know is not harmful. So when is chemical treatment appropriate? For larger infestations, more than just a few plants, large plants that are too large to be pulled out by hand, certain species that are very difficult to control using other methods, or if you're a landowner without endless time, energy, physical stamina, or money.
Lost you again, Emily. I don't know if you can hear me. Emily, can you hear me?
Except spring.
We lost you. Emily,
no.
we lost you for a while.
Oh, no. Okay. How back slide probably, or?
Yeah, go back to the chemical, the slide before.
Oh, man. I'm sorry. What a nightmare. I guess I'll just start.
We got to the point where if you don't have endless time, money, or energy, so basically everybody.
Okay. So I guess
Yeah, we got through the last
slide then. Okay. All right. Okay. So cut stump treatment is, I think, the chemical control option. The herbicide is applied to the cut stem any time of year except spring, using a bingo dauber, which has a sponge tip. You just sponge the herbicide onto the cut surface. It doesn't spill. You use a minimal amount of herbicide. The bingo dauber probably has 2 ounces of herbicide concentrate mixed with 2 ounces of water and colored dye. The herbicide gets drawn into the root system of the plant, which kills it. So you're using about a 25 to 40% herbicide solution on any woody species. As I mentioned, it's very targeted. With about 2 ounces of herbicide, you could treat hundreds and hundreds of plants. Foliar spraying is a much more diluted concentration. You use 2 to 4% herbicide concentration. It's applied to the leaves during the growing season using a backpack sprayer. This method's a little less targeted, obviously, than applying herbicide directly to the cut stump. But if you do it right, it can be targeted. It's important to pay attention to the droplet size that you're spraying. Larger droplets have less potential to drift to non-target plants. So it is appropriate for smaller plants in dense infestation, plants with smaller stems like barberry or rose that would be time consuming to use the cut stump method on because they've got so many stems. You don't want to apply foliar spraying to tall plants that are above your head, or when it's windy or if rain's in the forecast, as you're more likely to have herbicide drifting to non-target plants in those conditions. The snip and drip method can be used on Japanese knotweed and Phragmites. You cut the cane, drip in a few milliliters of herbicide into the hollow stem of each individual cane. You'll have to use about 3 to 5 milliliters of 18 to 25% herbicide for knotweed. I guess a little less for Phragmites. I've never used this method myself, but people that I know that have used it say that it's tricky because you can begin to approach the per acre application rate that's listed on the label. So you end up using a bit more herbicide than other methods. So in practice, a hybrid approach to invasive plant control is the best. Herbicide use is not the goal. Using herbicides to control non-native invasive plants is a tool which helps us achieve our goal of control. Our overarching goal is to promote healthy forests and healthy ecosystems, habitat, and biodiversity. And using herbicides makes it possible to reduce heavy infestations down to a level where manual or mechanical control is again possible. It's important to understand that herbicides will need to be one of the tools we use to solve this problem across our landscape. So some examples of a hybrid approach include hand pulling and cut stems, hand pulling and cut stump treatment on root fragments, hand pulling some species and treating others, cutting areas of dense infestations and coming back to treat the sprouts. So I've seen people use the last method. If there's a dense infestation that's somewhat tall, you can cut it down, it will resprout. You wait for it to resprout, and when it's about knee height, you can come back and spray it easily. And then you don't have to be spraying above your head. So this just makes foliar application a lot easier and less likely to cause herbicide drift. So because I mentioned herbicides, it's important to also mention that this is something we regulate in Vermont, as we should. The label is the law. You can apply some herbicides, Class B herbicides on your own land, but on other people's land, you need to be a certified pesticide applicator. I'm a certified pesticide applicator, and I recommend becoming a certified pesticide applicator. It isn't very hard to do. The Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets offers a day-long course. You can take the exam right at the end of the course. It provides a lot of common sense information about applying the.
Emily, we've lost you again. Can you hear me? Emily? Emily, we lost you after, I think you said there's a lot of common sense, something about taking this class.
Okay, so yes, no, I'm sorry. What a bummer. So yes, the course provides a lot of common sense information about applying these chemicals, provides information about how to avoid potential drift, information about how to do these things safely, different mixtures and formulations of herbicides that's good to know about. So it's a great course and I recommend it. If you own forest land and you're interested in working to control non-invasive plants on your land, being a certified pesticide applicator is going to be a good tool for you. So doing the right thing, said stewardship was going to be easy. We inherit these forests, which may not have been well managed in the past. They're complicated, they're profoundly altered and degraded and exploited. So rising to the occasion to address this legacy that we didn't create, but that humans created, requires us to make tough decisions, like whether it's appropriate to use herbicides to control dense infestations. Controlling invasive plants in our forests and other ecosystems is some of the most important and profound work. It's also some of the most challenging, frustrating, time-consuming, intense work that we do. We understand that we need to protect these ecosystems that we rely on. And so working to help keep them healthy and resilient is important, and it's the right thing to do. So as I've mentioned previously, vtinvasesorg, great resource about invasives in general, not only invasive plants, but also invasive organisms like emerald ash borer. It's got all kinds of interesting resources, so check it out. Some other resources that are available include the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, which provides cost-sharing plant control.
Emily, we've lost you again. Emily, can you hear me?
Service near me, you'll get the statewide list and you can go to whichever office location is most convenient. One of the most important prerequisites for eligibility to work with NRCS is that you have a forest management plan. The Nature Conservancy's Vermont Landowner's Guide to Invasive Terrestrial Plant Management is also an excellent resource. If you Google that, it'll pop right up. And county foresters are a free resource to all Vermont landowners, regardless of the size of ownership. So here are some of the other informational flyers put out by Knott and Hyde Park. And so if you're interested in getting involved or just learning more about what they're up to, there's their email address. The Hyde Park website is listed there on the bottom. I guess if you had any specific questions for those folks, it'd be your chance to ask.
Emily, I have a question. You didn't mention fire. I'm wondering if drip torch and fire is something used for invasives.
I know, yes, people do use, controlled burns on invasive plant infestations. I don't know if people doing that in Vermont, honestly, but I could see it working. It makes sense. It would be kind of the same as using the commercial torch burning method. So yes, it is a method that people use. I'm not aware of it being used in Vermont, at least as of yet. But it'd probably be best for, dense infestations where nothing else is growing except invasives.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. So I wanted to include a pitch for this great YouTube video about native biodiversity and invasive plants. The link is listed right there, that strange YouTube link. Doug Tallamy, who is a renowned entomologist, he talks about pollinator species, native natural communities, and plants. I thought it was really interesting, and I bet you would enjoy it too. If you found my talk to be somewhat interesting, you'll find his to be way better. He's got all kinds of great pictures of beautiful caterpillars and butterflies. I just thought it was a great video, and I bet you would enjoy it as well. So with that, are there any questions?
Emily, could you post that link in the chat, please? It was a hard one to
Sure.
write down.
I'll just leave it right there if that's,
Okay.
or I can copy it. Let me see if I can.
That was me. I found it, loaded it, and I put the link in the chat.
Good, great. Thank you. Okay, I don't know if I can turn my video back on. I'm sorry if that was too quick. We're only at 5:01, but maybe we can have some kind of discussion, or if anyone has any specific questions or anything like that.
Emily, I wanted to ask you about the honeysuckle. You showed a picture of it with a pink flower. Is there an invasive that's also got a white flower? Or are they all?
There are multiple different invasive varieties here. I believe there is one with white. There's also one with orange flowers.
Right.
Yep. The key to, if you're unsure if it's native or not, if you cut the stem, if it's got a fifth, then you know it's non-native.
And that flowers, do you know when roughly? I know last year I remember seeing a lot of flowering something along the roadside. It's early, is it? Well, anyway, I'll just wait and see it whenever it comes out, because I'm interested in trying to be able to identify it this year, because I never really paid attention. And, yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yep. You're welcome. It's opposite branching pattern. So that's a great way to be able to tell. The branches will be coming out of the stem completely across from each other, and the buds will be right at the point where the stem is, where those branches are touching the stem. The bud will be situated like right in the pocket there. Once you learn to identify it, it'll stick in your mind for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Emily, do you ever try to plant a native species after doing removal, or something to actually displace the invasive?
Yeah, I've heard of people trying to do that, especially with like knotweed. I think with mixed success. I think it just depends on the site. If you're going to do that, make sure that you're creating conditions that are going to be favorable for what you're planting there. So if it requires a lot of light, make sure you have a lot of light in that area would be my recommendation. Select the right species for the site.
And you mentioned allelopathic plants, so I imagine you'd have to be working with something that hasn't poisoned the soil.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
If we do when we do a forest management plan with you, can we get down to that level of detail, kind of, as far as, plans to shift a habitat from an invasive plant to something more appropriate for biodiversity values, and how?
Yeah, definitely. I would love to see more plans that have that kind of detail. Yes, I think that's a great idea. And having it in writing that you signed off on it might help hold people more accountable, so seems like a great idea.
Thank you.
Emily, there's a question asking that whether when road crews mow knotweed on the side of the road, does that spread it?
Oh, yes, it does. Any fragment of the plant can create a new plant. So it does. And that's a big problem in Vermont. If you ever drive 89 or essentially any of our highways, it's scary how quickly we're spreading plants just by mowing. And we tend to mow at the worst time of year when plants have bolted, they've gone to seed, and then we mow it. So we're just spreading it further. And I know at least our department has tried working with VTrans. I think it's a matter of like the fiscal year ends right as the plants are going to seed. So they can't mow until they have the money available, and that's when the plants are have gone to seed. So it's a problem for sure.
Other questions? This has just been wonderful, Emily. I've learned a huge amount, and I feel invigorated to tackle the honeysuckle by the side of the road.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Other questions or observations for Emily?
I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay. So Emily, what do you recommend if you have an infestation of, the honeysuckle or the buckthorn or the knotweed, what do you recommend that you do with all the cuttings? Like, what do you do with them?
Right. Either you could burn them or bag them up and bring them to the dump. I think burning is a good option. Even just hanging them, if it's not a ton of material and you're okay with just letting it hang in a tree or, just not in contact with the soil. Once the plant's dead, it won't be able to do anything. So once it's dried out, it's not a concern anymore.
Right.
Seeds or berries. Yeah.
Right. Because just one of my concerns is, you said bringing stuff to the dump. To me, it just seems like I'm wondering if there's got to be a way that somehow we can compost these things or grind them up or whatever. I do know that Green Mountain Compost in Williston takes invasive species in their composting facility to turn it into compost. And I'm just wondering, that's one of the things that our Not in Hyde Park group would like to work on, is coming up with some sort of a drying site or a composting facility that you can bring these invasives to compost them versus putting them in a bag and bringing them to the dump, which just seems, to fill up a landfill with a bunch of plastic bags with, the knotweed or the honeysuckle or whatever. I'm just wondering if that's anything on your radar, to come up with some sort of a facility that you could do that, the composting or drying or whatever.
Right. That is a great point, Wendy. I completely agree with you. And I am not sure that we are undertaking any efforts to do that, but maybe we are. I'll check with we have an invasive plant specialist in our department named Elizabeth.
Mhm.
She might have more information on that. I can check with her and try to let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Actually, Emily, I'd like to just, it's Mary again. I just wanted to say, I appreciated your, very much your remarks about stewardship and responsibility. And I don't think we've used that really as a way of communicating with people about knotweed, but I was moved by that and I appreciated it. I mean, obviously I understood it. I appreciated you saying it and making a point about it. And it's quite motivating really because sometimes you're dealing with the stuff and you think, what am I doing? It's just hopeless. People will tell you it's hopeless, but it's important. So anyway, it's important that you did this talk too. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you appreciated that point. That's how I felt about it as well. When I heard Ethan bring it up, I said, that's exactly how I feel. And I know anyone else that cares about this problem feels that way. If there are ways that we can get other people to understand why we do this kind of work, then that's a good thing. So thank you.
Any other last questions? I did want to ask you about goutweed. I have an infestation at my mother's farm that just is overwhelming. And I've resorted to Roundup, even though I'm a beekeeper. I don't know what else to do other than plastic some of it. Do you have ideas?
Yeah. Yes, plastic is an option. A friend of mine last year took to burning her patch like multiple times. Just use a torch and burn it. And then when it sprouts up again, burn it again. You could try that. I don't know. It's tough. These plants are hard to control.
Yeah, they certainly are.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And any other last questions before we end? Well, this has been great. And I have a lot of people's emails. If there was a couple places in the talk, Emily, where you said you would share back information.
Yep.
So if you didn't register with me at the library and you want to get Emily's responses to some of these things, send me your email. And Emily, if you want to send me anything you're looking up, I can send it out to everybody.
Okay, I will.
Okay, and I'll also, I think, send out the links that you gave us and the resources, which were wonderful.
Yeah, if you need me to share this presentation, like I could share the PowerPoint.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, it's going to be on Green Mountain Access TV, but maybe if people want the PowerPoint, I don't want to send it out to everybody, but I could if you send it to me.
Yeah, just send it. And I guess if nobody wants it, it's not a big deal. It doesn't hurt my feelings.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Emily, and I don't think I received it from you. You had mentioned you were going to send it. And I didn't get it.
I know I didn't. I was still tweaking it at the last minute. So
okay.
I will.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you very, very much.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.